All right, so are you ready to dive into a world full of dragons?
Oh, always ready for a dragon adventure.
Well, today we're tackling Rebecca Yarros' Fourth Wing. It's been everywhere online,
Yeah, it feels like you can't escape it.
right? And the reviews, I mean, they are all over the place.
Some people are calling it the next big thing.
But then others are, I don't know, they're not impressed.
Definitely a polarizing one.
So that's why we're here. Is Fourth Wing actually worth all the hype? Let's find out.
Sounds like a plan. So where do we even begin with this one?
Well, I think we got to start with the basics.
All right, back to basics.
Like, what's the story even about? Just to set the stage for anyone who hasn't picked it up yet.
Okay, so imagine a world where dragons are like the ultimate weapon.
Oh, I like where this is going.
They defend humanity from, well, we don't really know who or what. That part's a little fuzzy.
The mysterious enemy.
Yes.
Classic.
Exactly. And our main character, Violet Sorrengail, she gets thrown into this world of dragon riders, but she'd rather be hitting the books, not the battlefield.
Yeah, she's not exactly cut out for the warrior life, is she?
Not really,
But her mom, General Sorrengail, she's intense.
to say the least.
Throws Violet right into Dragon Rider training at Bastiath War College, which, from what I've gathered, it's not exactly a walk in the park.
Oh, no, it's more like a pass or die situation.
Intense.
Mary. And that's actually one of the criticisms that keeps popping up in these reviews.
Really? What do they say?
People are questioning, like, the logic behind this whole intense training thing.
Yeah, it does seem a bit counterproductive, doesn't it?
Right. You're trying to train elite dragon riders, humanity's last hope, and all that, but you're also, like, actively killing off a good chunk of them in the process.
Yeah, not the best strategy.
Definitely raises some eyebrows.
And then on top of all of that, Violet also has to deal with a physical disability, which, I mean, come on, talk about adding another layer of complexity to her journey.
Totally. I mean, that's what makes her story even more compelling, right? She's not your typical, super strong, able-bodied hero.
Exactly. And I think that's where the book starts to, like, play with some of those familiar YA dystopian tropes like you see in Divergent or something. It's that whole, like, prove yourself worthy kind of thing.
Oh, for sure. The underdog story. We'd love to see it.
Always. But, speaking of challenges, we have to talk about the dragons themselves.
Oh, yeah, the stars of the show.
Right. And Yarros has created this, like, really unique take on dragon lore, especially when it comes to that whole rider-dragon bond.
Yeah, the bond's a big deal in this world.
Huge. They can communicate telepathically, which, on one hand, is pretty cool.
Super cool.
But some reviewers are arguing that it kind of makes the dragons less intimidating. You know what I mean?
I get it. Like, the classic image of a dragon is this fierce, untamed beast. And when they can just chat with their riders, it takes away a bit of that mystery, that primal fear factor.
It does.
But on the flip side, that telepathic bond opens up a whole new dynamic in terms of, like, magic and power.
Oh, yeah, totally. One review even pointed out how it makes magic depend on cooperation, not just, raw individual power.
Which is pretty cool. You have to work together, rider and dragon, to tap into that magical energy.
It's a partnership. It makes you think about who really holds the power, right?
Oh, yeah, totally.
Is it the rider? Is it the dragon?
Or is it something else entirely?
Ooh, interesting. That's a great question. And some reviewers are pointing out how the bond is presented as this, like, mark of good character,
Yeah.
Like, if you have a strong bond with your dragon, you must be a good person.
Right, but then we have characters like Jack, who is basically the worst.
Oh, tell me about it.
But he still manages to bond with the dragon.
So it throws that whole idea out the window, doesn't it?
Exactly. Makes you wonder if the dragon's motivations are as pure as we're led to believe.
Definitely adds a layer of mystery to it all. But okay, let's shift gears for a second.
Sure. Where are we headed?
We got to talk about the character who seems to have everyone either swooning or, like, rolling their eyes.
Oh, you mean Azaden Rears?
The one and only Mr. Brooding Dragon Rider himself.
Yeah, he's definitely the character that's sparking the most did.
He's got that classic bad boy appeal, right?
For sure. Mysterious, powerful, a little bit dangerous.
And I've seen some reviewers comparing him to the Darkling from Shadow and Bone.
Ah, yes, the classic brooding hero archetype.
But then other reviewers are like, nah, he's too predictable.
Yeah, like he's just a cardboard cutout of a fantasy heartthrob.
Yeah.
No real depth.
So where do you land on the Xaden debate?
Honestly, I'm a little torn.
Really?
I can see the appeal, but I also think some of those criticisms are valid.
Like what?
Well, he does rely on a lot of those overused tropes, the brooding demeanor, the secretive past, the whole I'm tortured but I'll protect you thing.
True.
And there's this whole other argument that keeps coming up in the reviews, the if the roles were reversed thing.
Hmm. Tell me more about that.
So some reviewers are saying that if Xaden was the one constantly objectifying Violet, like commenting on her body and all that, there would be a lot more pushback.
Oh, I see what you mean.
It raises some interesting questions about double standards and how we perceive male and female characters in romance.
Yeah, that's a valid point. Food for thought.
For sure. But regardless of how you feel about Xaden, there's no denying that he's a major driving force in the story, especially when it comes to the romance.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And speaking of the romance, we got to unpack that because it seems to be the most talked about aspect of the book.
Yeah, people are either obsessed with it or they find it super problematic.
No in between.
It seems that way.
Okay, so some readers are like, head over heels for Violet and Xaden's chemistry.
Yeah, the sparks are definitely flying.
But then other readers are calling it rushed and saying it relies on too many convenient plot devices.
I can see that, like the whole mated dragons thing.
Well, don't even get me started on that. It's like when two dragons choose each other as mates, their riders are suddenly drawn to each other. Come on.
Right. It's like instant love, but it's being forced on them by their dragon.
Exactly. So it makes you question whether their love is actually genuine or if it's just like their dragons pulling the strings.
It's a tricky situation. It does make you wonder about free will and all that.
Totally. And then there's the whole ethical question of their relationship. Even if it's allowed in their society, there's still a massive power imbalance between a commanding officer and a cadet.
It's a recipe for disaster.
Right. It's like, are they really choosing to be together, or are they being manipulated by their dragons and societal pressures?
It's a big question mark hanging over their whole relationship.
So we've got a compelling protagonist, a controversial love interest, and a world full of powerful dragons. But what about the world itself?
Ah, the world building.
Let's unpack some of the criticisms we're seeing about that.
So some reviewers are saying that the world feels a bit underdeveloped, especially when it comes to like the war that's always looming in the background.
Oh yeah, it does feel like the war is more of a backdrop than an actual driving force in the story. Like, we know there's an enemy, but we don't really know who they are or why they're fighting.
Right. It's all a bit vague. And then there's the logic or lack thereof behind certain aspects of the world.
Oh yeah, like what?
Like one reviewer mentioned the scene where a character casually reveals he's allergic to oranges. And we're like, this is so random and unnecessary. It pulled me right out of the story.
I mean, I can see how that would be distracting.
Right. It's those little inconsistencies that can sometimes make or break a fantasy world. You need that attention to detail to create a world that feels believable, even if it's full of dragons and magic.
And some reviewers felt like the foreshadowing was a bit too heavy-handed.
Like, they figured out the major plot twists way too early.
Exactly. And it took away from the surprise.
Subtlety is key.
All right, so we've covered the plot, the characters, the world building. Now let's talk about the writing itself, because that seems to be another point of contention.
Some love it, some hate it.
Pretty much. Some readers are into that fast-paced, action-packed style, while others are finding it a bit lacking in depth.
Yeah, and there's this one review that pointed out the overuse of, like, periods. Emphasis.
Yeah, I noticed that too.
It's a stylistic choice for sure, but it can be a bit distracting if it's overdone.
Agreed. And there were definitely moments where I felt like I was being spoon-fed information instead of discovering it naturally through the story.
The dreaded info dump. It's a tough balance, right? You want to give the reader enough information to understand the world, but you don't want to just throw it all at them at once.
Subtlety.
It's all about finding that balance. But let's circle back to the world building for a moment.
Okay, yeah. I'm curious to hear what you have to say about that.
So while some reviewers found it lacking, there are also some really interesting elements to unpack, like the magic system, for example. With its focus on the rider-dragon bond, it's a pretty fresh take on how magic operates in a fantasy world.
Definitely. Making magic dependent on cooperation rather than individual power.
Exactly. It makes you wonder how those power dynamics play out in a society built around that kind of magic system.
Oh, totally. What are the rules of this magic system? How does it affect the society and the power structures within this world?
So many questions. And then there's that whole thing about how bonding with a dragon is supposed to be a sign of good character.
Right, but then we have Jack, who's, well, Jack.
Exactly.
And he has a dragon, too.
It throws a wrench into the whole thing, doesn't it? It makes you wonder what the dragons are really getting out of this whole bond situation. Are their motives truly as pure as we're led to believe, or is there something more going on?
And they seem to have a lot more control than we realize at first. They can influence their riders' emotions. They can communicate telepathically.
It makes you wonder if the riders are truly in control, or if they're being subtly manipulated by their dragon companions.
It's like, who's really in charge here?
Right.
Okay, but let's go back to the war for a second. One reviewer brought up this really interesting point about how the vagueness surrounding the war might actually be intentional. Like the author is deliberately withholding information to create a sense of mystery and intrigue.
Ooh, I like that theory.
Right.
It's like those missing puzzle pieces that keep you guessing and wanting to learn more.
It makes you wonder if there's more to this war than meets the eye. What if there are, like, hidden agendas at play, secret alliances?
What if the enemy isn't who we think it is?
Ooh, the plot thickens.
Exactly.
Okay, but hold on, I want to rewind for a sec. You mentioned earlier how the dragons can, like, transfer their emotions to their riders.
Oh, yeah, that's a fascinating detail.
But does it go both ways? Can riders influence their dragon's emotions too?
That's a great question. It's not really addressed in the book, which just adds to the mystery of the bond, right? How much free will do these writers truly have?
It's all very intriguing.
It is.
We're starting to see that Fourth Wing is way more than just a simple dragon rider romance. There are layers of intrigue here, unanswered questions that make you think a little deeper about this world and the characters.
Totally agree. It's definitely more than just a fluffy read.
All right, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to talk about a theme that keeps popping up in these reviews: defying expectations.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
Huge. And I think it applies to so many aspects of the book.
Cool.
Like, first and foremost, Violet herself.
Right. She's constantly underestimated because of her physical limitations.
But she doesn't let that define her.
Nope. She's determined to prove that she can be a successful dragon rider, even if it means going against everyone's expectations, including her own family.
It's all about challenging those preconceived notions about what a dragon rider should be.
And proving that strength doesn't always come from physical prowess.
It's a powerful message, especially for anyone who's ever felt like they don't fit in.
Absolutely. Like, your dreams are valid no matter what anyone else says.
And Violet's not the only one defying expectations in this book.
Ooh.
What about the dragons themselves?
Ooh, good point.
In so many fantasy stories, dragons are portrayed as these fearsome beasts, symbols of destruction.
Yeah, just mindless monsters.
But in Fourth Wing, there's so much more than that. They're intelligent, complex creatures with their own desires and motivations. And they're not just blindly following orders. They have their own agenda.
Which is pretty refreshing.
It is.
Yeah.
And they have this unique bond with their riders, which creates a whole new dynamic in terms of power and control. So, in a way, they're also defying expectations, challenging those traditional portrayals of dragons in fantasy.
And let's not forget about the romance between Violet and Zagden. Talk about defying expectations.
Oh, for sure.
It flips the script on that typical power dynamic we see in so many fantasy romances.
Totally. Violet's not just some damsel in distress waiting to be rescued.
Nope.
She's a strong, capable woman who can hold her own.
Even against a brooding dragon rider.
And their relationship is full of tension and conflict. They're from different worlds. They have different goals. And then, of course, their dragons are literally trying to push them together.
It's a recipe for chaos.
It is.
Yeah.
But it's also what makes it so interesting.
It's a reminder that fantasy can be more than just swords and sorcery.
Right.
It can be a platform for exploring these complex themes, for challenging societal norms.
Fourth Wing is definitely doing that, even if it's not always perfect in its execution.
Speaking of not being perfect, we should probably address those technical aspects of the writing.
Oh, yeah, those mixed reviews.
Exactly.
Some readers have pointed out issues with the pacing, the dialogue, even the sentence structure.
Like we said earlier, some found the dialogue a bit clunky, the overuse of short sentences.
It can be a little jarring.
It can. It's a good reminder that even in a fantastical world with dragons and magic, those technical aspects of writing still matter. If the writing isn't strong, it can pull the reader out of the story.
No matter how exciting the plot might be.
Exactly.
And some readers felt like the pacing was a bit uneven. Like sometimes it felt rushed, other times it dragged a bit.
Pacing is key.
It is. especially in a fantasy novel where you're building a world and introducing these complex characters.
It's about finding the right rhythm, that balance between those slower, more introspective moments and the action-packed sequences.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the dragons, the magic, the romance, the writing style.
We've hit all the major points.
But before we move on to part two, I want to touch on one more thing that really stood out to me. Family legacy.
Oh, yeah. That's a big theme for Violet.
Huge. She's constantly grappling with the weight of her family's expectations, especially those of her mother. General Sorengale. Talk about pressure. Right. It's like she's trying to forge her own path while also living up to this legacy of this powerful, influential family.
Hmm.
And it's a struggle that I think a lot of us can relate to, even if our families aren't quite as, intense as the Sorengale clan.
It's a universal theme, that desire to find your place in the world while also honoring your roots.
And for Violet, it's even more complicated because she doesn't really fit the mold of what a Sorengale dragon rider is supposed to be.
Right. She's not physically imposing like her siblings,
And she'd much rather be a scholar than a warrior.
but she still has that fire in her, that determination.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes her such a compelling character. She's not perfect. He makes mistakes, but she never gives up. She's constantly pushing herself to be better.
For herself and for the people she cares about.
It's a reminder that true strength doesn't always come from physical power.
It can also come from resilience, from determination, and from the courage to be yourself.
Even when the world is telling you to be someone else.
Exactly.
So we've got a lot to think about here. A complex world, a flawed but compelling protagonist, a controversial love interest, and a whole lot of unanswered questions.
That's a lot to process.
It is. So I think we need a little break.
Agreed.
Let's take a quick breather, gather our thoughts, and come back for part two, where we'll delve even deeper into Fourth Wing.
Sounds like a plan.